12. The Law in the Old Testament. 1. God the King. The Hebrew word for law is Torah, meaning a pointing out, a direction, or authoritative direction. Previously, authoritative direction had been given to Adam, the line of Seth, Noah, and his descendants, Abraham and his heirs, as well as to other men, as witness Melchizedek and Job. It is impossible for a relationship with God to exist without law. Since the modernist lacks a faith in the sovereign God, he cannot accept the existence of a given law from the beginning. He must posit instead an evolution in man's self-awareness and a development of law in terms of man's experience with reality. As a result, the modernist sees the law as a late codification of Israel's national experience. S.R. Driver, in his very influential work, An Introduction to the Literature of the Old Testament, 1897, assumed an evolutionary position and made no attempt to prove his thesis. The faith of the day was with him. The same position was given an important restatement by Robert H. Pfeiffer in his Introduction to the Old Testament, 1941. The basic premise of such critics is an evolutionary and philosophical humanism. Not surprisingly, with Darwin, such a faith came into its own. The comment of Alice on this point is telling. Even a cursory examination of the literature of the higher criticism makes it clear that it has been increasingly dominated by three great principles of evolutionary theory. 1. That development is the explanation of all phenomena. 2. That this development results from forces latent in man without any supernatural assistance. And 3. That the comparative method, which uses a naturalistic yardstick, must determine the nature and rate of this development. In biblical history, because the law is always the assumed perspective of every book of the Old Testament, the judgments of the prophets and writers are always on the premise of the law. The book of Joshua, for example, begins with the reminder to the people that it is their privilege and strength that they are the people of the law, that they have God's authoritative direction. Joshua chapter 1, verses 7 to 9. They are repeatedly reminded that the law is their source of strength and the sign of their covenantal bond as a nation with God. Joshua chapter 22, verse 5. Chapter 23, verses 1 to 6. Chapter 24, verses 1 to 27. The individual mark of the covenant, circumcision, is cited in Joshua chapter 5, as well as the Passover. The laws of the ban and of conquest appear in chapters 6, verse 17, chapter 9, verse 23, and chapter 11, verse 20. The division of the land in terms of the law is described in chapters 13, verses 14 to 33, chapter 14, verses 1 to 15, and chapters 17 to 19. And the cities of refuge in chapter 20. Skipping over to Ruth, we find here the practices of gleaning, redemption of the land, and the levirate. The book of Judges is especially sharp in its presupposition of the law. It describes the apostasy of Israel from God and his law, Judges chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, verse 10, 15, verse 17, chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, chapter 5, verse 8, chapter 6, verse 1 and verse 10, verses 25 and 26, chapter 10, verses 13 and 14, etc. The central point and theme of Judges is stated repeatedly. Chapter 17, verse 6, chapter 18, verse 1, chapter 21, verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Chapter 21, verse 25. The same point prefaces an ugly account of depravity in chapters 19 and 20. Chapter 19, verse 1. Meyer's interpretation of this statement is that because there was no king in Israel, there was no restraint upon families except that of tribal authority and custom. He assumes the meaning to be the lack of a human monarch and the institution of monarchy. Farrer's sorry comment is similar. This shows that these narratives were written, or more probably edited, in the days of the monarchy. Did that which was right in his own eyes. This notice is added to show why there was no authoritative interference of princes or ruler to prevent idolatrous or lawless proceedings. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 8. Ye shall not do after all the things which we do here this day, every man what is right in his own eyes. The surprising fact about Farrar's blindness is that he cited Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 8, which is a part of a statement of God's kingship and the claim of his sovereign law. The point of Judges is that Israel repeatedly forsook God the king and abandoned his law to go a-whoring after other gods, failing to obey the commandments of the Lord. Judges chapter 2, verse 17. God was Israel's lawmaker, both as sovereign God and universal king, and as Israel's covenant king. Human kingship is not the answer. In fact, the pagan oppressors of Israel had human kings, and Israel itself had, over part of its realm, a human king, Abimelech, chapters 9 and 10. The kingship of Abimelech is presented as an aspect of the denial of the kingship of God. Another vivid contrast is drawn between the kingship of Jabin, king of Canaan, reigning in Hazor, whose captain was Sisera, Judges chapter 4, verse 2, and the kingship of God. The Song of Deborah gives us a poor picture of Israel, defeated, cowardly, and ill-armed. The battle was won by God, the King of Israel. They fought from heaven. The stars in their courses fought against Sisera. Judges chapter 5, verse 20. God, as universal king, had used the elements to defeat and destroy the Canaanite armies. As king, he then meted out curse and blessing in terms of loyalty to his cause. Curse ye Meroz, said the angel of the Lord, curse ye bitterly the inhabitants thereof, because they came not to the help of the Lord against the mighty. Blessed above women shall Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, be. Blessed shall she be above women in the tent. Judges chapter 5, verses 23 and 24. Here we have the curse and the blessing of the law pronounced by the giver of the law, the king. After describing Jael's execution of Sisera, Deborah declared, "The mother of Sisera looked out at a window and cried through the lattice, 'Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the wheels of his chariots?' Her wise ladies answered her, yea, she returned answer to herself. Have they not sped? Have they not divided the prey? To every man a damsel or two? To Sisera a prey of diverse colours of needlework? Of diverse colours of needlework on both sides, meet for the neck of them that take the spoil? So let all thine enemies perish, O Lord, but let them that love him be as the sun when he goeth forth in his might." Judges chapter 5, verses 28 to 31. Deborah's language is intense and graphic. The damsels Sisera's men dreamed of possessing is literally uterus. To every man a uterus or two. Kyle and Delitzsch translate the latter part of verse 31 thus: "But let those that love him be like the rising of the sun in its strength," and state that this is a striking image of the exaltation of Israel to a more and more glorious unfolding of its destiny. Even more, it is an image of the blessing of God, the King, on those who love, serve, and obey him. In a psalm celebrating the law of God, Psalm 19 verses 7 to 14, God's rule over the universe is also cited, and again we have the image of the sun, which is a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. Psalm 19, verses 4 and 5. It is after he describes the law and order apparent in the heavens, the firmament, the earth, and the sun, that David joyfully declares, "The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul." Psalm 19, verse 7. The glory of God is revealed in all the universe by his law order. That same glory is manifested in man and his word when the law is obeyed. This same image is in mind in Deborah's song. It was because the law and kingship of God were denied by Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes, that, instead of being comparable to the sun in its glory among the nations, Israel was instead all too often in captivity to alien powers. Returning to Torah, or direction, a pointing out, Jesus Christ referred to himself as the Torah when he declared, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me." John chapter 14, verse 6. The Greek word for way is hodos, a proceeding, a course of conduct. In Acts chapter 13, verse 10, Romans chapter 11, verse 33, and Revelation chapter 15, verse 3, according to Joseph Henry Thayer's Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament, it means the purposes and ordinances of God, his way of dealing with men. The use of I am echoed the divine name. Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. The reference to the way spoke of the law. Jesus Christ, as the incarnate God, was also the declaration of God's righteousness and law. By this sentence, Christ made himself inseparable from either the Godhead or from the law. He is the Torah or direction of God. By his declaration, Christ made both himself and the law more readily identifiable. The alternative to Christ and the law is thus anarchy and lawlessness. It means a life without meaning or direction. Christ is the declaration of God's direction or law. The law points us to the right road. Sin, hamartia, is missing the mark. It does involve moving in the right direction, but it is a falling short, a missing of the mark. Anomia, sin, is lawlessness. It means moving in the wrong direction and denying direction. It is anarchy. If we say we have no sin, hamartia, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. 1 John chapter 1, verse 8. It is the godless who are sinners in the sense of being anti-law, hostile to God's direction. The word used is anomos, lawless or without law. Acts chapter 2, verse 3, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 8. However, all men who commit sin, hamartia, habitually and carelessly, are in reality not Christians and are guilty of lawlessness, anomia. Whatsoever committeth sin, hamartia, that is, all who practice sin as their way of life, transgresseth also the law, anomia. Such persons are actually anti-law, lawless. For sin, hamartia, that is, the habitual practice of sin, is the transgression of the law. Anomia is the practice of lawlessness. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. The law is an indictment, a death sentence. If we are headed in the wrong direction, if we move in God's directed path, the law is a schoolmaster, guiding us all our days into God's way of righteousness and truth. Galatians chapter 3, verses 24 and 25 states that, after that faith is come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. Verse 25. Does this mean the end of the law? On the contrary, we now learn not from the law as an indictment, but from Christ the way, and God our Father, how to walk in the appointed direction or in the law. For ye are all the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. Galatians chapter 3, verse 26. The contrast is not between law and no law, but between the immature life of slavery under a tutor and the life of sonship with all its privileges and rights. Luther saw both the law and sin as abolished and declared that, to the extent that I take hold of Christ by faith, therefore to that extent the law has been abrogated for me. This is antinomianism and alien to St. Paul. St. Paul attacked man-made laws and man-made interpretations of the law as the way of justification. The law can never justify. It does sanctify. And there is no sanctification by lawlessness.